as you heard from Mike, we're dedicated to reinforcing equity in all of our work. And as we know, a circular economy is better designed to overcome challenges, including racial disparities, because we are stronger by working together and building relationships with communities and having a community-centered approach. So I could not think of a better speaker as we step into the next 5 years of our journey, because it's never been more clear that the needs of society and the needs of businesses need to be aligned. And so I am happy to welcome Dr. Weslynne Ashton. I'm going to drop her full bio into the chat box because it's very lengthy and you're going to be so amazed at her background, but just a couple key points. She is at Illinois Institute of Technology. She focuses on transitioning our sociological systems towards sustainability and equity with industrial ecology and the circular economy. It's not very often that you meet PhDs that focus on the circular economy. So really happy to find a kindred spirit here. And with that, please help me welcome Dr. Weslynne Ashton.
Thank you, Amy. I want to say, it's such an honor to be here with you all today. And I'm really excited to share some of the work that I have been doing in Chicago. Next slide, please. All right, we can go on to the next slide. So I don't have to tell you all right? This is something that we're all familiar with. We know that modern capitalism has been built on the premise of a linear economy, that the earth has unlimited resources that we can extract to convert into useful products and services for society, and that the earth has enough space and the capacity to absorb the waste that we discard after we've used our products. It has delivered significant improvements in health, wealth, and quality of life around the planet, but has done so unequally. Next slide. There has also been a significant environmental cost at all stages, from material extraction through production, distribution, consumption, and disposal. Next slide. A prime distinction between the linear and the circular economy is the focus on the circulation of resources, such that capital can be regenerated to restore and elevate the functioning of socio-ecological systems. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation has been instrumental in popularizing the idea of the circular economy as a continuous positive development cycle that preserves and enhances natural capital, optimizes resource yields, and minimizes system risk by managing the finite stocks and the renewable flows of resources. They distinguish that in order to effectively manage these cycles, we need to separate biological from technical materials, with the biological materials being decomposed back into organic matter, while the latter has to be recycled into components. And there are many cascading reuses. And so I think, this is something that everyone in this room is familiar with. And I'd just like to pose a question. So Julian, if we can go on to the next slide, which I think is actually the Mentimeter. All right. So I'd like to just ask you all, given the work that you have been doing, what do you think is missing from this vision of a circular economy?
This Mentimeter is on the same screen, so you should be able to just advance to your next question on there.
All right, so this is a setup, right? The focus of this session is equity, so it's not surprising that that's the word that pops up the most here. But people, health, incentives, and leadership, and looking at behavior are also things that are popping up. So thank you all for your input there. We can move on to the next slide. So the economist Keith Warrett has been promoting the idea of a donut economy, in which the planetary boundaries provide an upper limit on our economic activities. And we know that we're already exceeding the safe and known limits for several boundaries, such as our nitrogen and phosphorus flows into the environment, and are rapidly approaching the estimated carbon dioxide concentration limits at which major disruptions of our planetary biogeochemical cycles are anticipated. The donut economy includes a social foundation. So this puts people at the center, recognizing that all of our activities take place within the constraints of nature, that the financial flows among actors in the economy are just one type of the resources that are circulated, right? So when we talk about circular economy, we're often talking about materials and money, but the economy is just one part of our whole embedded system, right? So the economy is embedded in our society, which is embedded in the Earth's resources. And so we need multiple types of resources to be circulated for a well-functioning society and Earth system. Next slide, please. A related concept is being promoted by Alexandre Lemille, who is advancing the idea of the circular human sphere. So this is centering humans within the butterfly diagram of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation as a third stock of resources, right? So we have biological resources in green, their technical resources in blue, and human resources at the center. And it's recognizing that human capital, knowledge, and relationships are the source of ingenuity to drive these biological and technical cycles. So we need to see that humans play an important role, not only as consumers, but as the source of innovation to develop new technologies for regenerating natural capital and adding value to the technical materials. So they're defining a circular economy 2.0 that's built on the recognition that waste of all types, so pollution in the environmental dimension and in the social dimension, poverty and inequity, exist only in human societies, and they must be designed out in order for humanity to thrive in the future. Next slide. I want to just pause to share a little bit of my journey. And I think, I'm trying not to be too obnoxious and self-aggrandizing, but I think it parallels how we need to think about the circular economy. So my undergraduate degree is in environmental engineering from MIT. And so probably, like many of you on this call, I learned about pollutant fate and transport and contaminant treatment and wastewater management. But it was in my final semester at MIT that I took a course in the politics of sustainable development, which introduced me to the idea of industrial ecology, which I thought was really brilliant, right? So why should we be focusing on cleaning up waste when we could be designing it out in the first place? So I did my graduate study at Yale, where we, in industrial ecology, think about redesigning our industrial systems to be more efficient in the use of resources. And we use tools like life cycle assessment, material and energy flow analysis to really understand the environmental impacts of our industrial activities. But along the way, one of the realizations that I came to is that, we talk about material flows, but materials don't flow. There are management decisions about what materials flow where, with particular goals and expected costs and benefits that are often unequally distributed. So I moved into a management and faculty position at Illinois Tech's Stewart School of Business. And I've been working on circular economy for, I would say, 2 decades now, right? So throughout my time at Yale and now at Illinois Tech. And a few years ago, I started a collaboration with our Institute of Design, in which I've been adopting a more community-engaged, participatory action research methods to engage with more diverse communities. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that shows up in the work that I'm doing. And next slide, please. So the circular economy can be applied at multiple levels. Right, so our micro level focuses on redesigning products and activities within the firm. At the meso level, we can look at activities that facilitate partnerships across groups of firms, such as industrial symbiosis across different supply chains and within supply chains. traditional supply chains. At the macro level, we're looking at cities, nations, and policies for making systemic change. Next slide. So in my group's work, we have been trying to expand the concept of resources that are needed within a circular economy. So we can think about capital as any type of resource that's capable of adding to other resources, right? So in typical circular economy work, we look at natural capital, financial capital, manufactured capital, right? Is the kind of resources that are needed to power economies. We have added the need for looking at digital capital, right? Because so many of our resources these days, our data, our information and communication technology frameworks are built on data. We also recognize that there are different types of social capital. So human capital, what's owned by individuals, their knowledge, social capital that focuses on the relationships between individuals and also organizations, cultural capital that focuses on the norms within particular groups, and political capital, which looks at the distribution of power within organizations and between organizations. Next slide. So I'd like to run through an example, a case that we've been working on in the Chicago region. So the Calumet Collaborative is a nonprofit partnership between business, government, nonprofit stakeholders that lie in the region between Illinois and Indiana to advance a thriving region. So the Calumet region is post-industrial. There are many brownfields and former industrial sites. There used to be a major port, lots of steelworks. ArcelorMittal remains as one of the last large industries in the region. The region is also characterized by natural and cultural heritage sites such as the Indiana Dunes and the Pullman Historic District. So we've partnered with the Calumet Collaborative to explore economic development pathways for the region, focusing on brownfields and circularity, considering how we might map the assets of the region, so both the things that are currently viewed as assets and the things that are not viewed as assets. So brownfields are typically seen as problematic to be able to revitalizing a community. Next slide. So we have a very design-focused approach where we engage diverse stakeholders through a series of workshops and prototyping inventions. So in this particular project, we had 3 stages. The first focused on sense making, so gathering secondary data to understand what the assets were in the community. A second stage around reframing, thinking about how these assets might be made more useful or framed in a way that people see them as assets and not as problems. And third, to envision a pathway for utilizing brownfields. So at all of these stages, we emphasize consultation and co-creation with participants. So after 3 rounds of prototyping and developing the conceptual platforms, we had a final co-creation workshop. And so this took place over the course of a semester with community leaders and subject matter experts from our networks and the networks of our partners to think about how we would design a new platform. So it looked at considering the efforts that were going on across multiple systems. So thinking about community building, job creation, new financing models, and policy making. Next slide. The envisioning workshop, the final workshop, we used this 8 capitals framework to identify the systems dynamics that were not previously considered, and recognizing the need for new engagement models with diverse communities. So we identified 5 strategies for valuing these different types of resources to build a circular economy in the region. So the first is empowering science, so increasing local leadership capacity in applied scientific research so that new means for tracking and understanding the interactions between the socio-technical and socio-ecological systems can help to provide an evidence-based decision-making process for what to do with the brownfields. greater involvement of residents, so incorporating the dynamics of people's daily lives to intervene in different systems. So how this showed up was using assets like community block groups to facilitate the exchange of information and also use people's knowledge to bring into the work that we're doing. The third strategy is leveraging assets, so unlocking the potential of existing initiatives in the region, as well as uncovering underutilized resources that could be activated for a transition towards a circular economy. The fourth focused on strengthening the local economy, where we try to recognize the economic activities and ambitions of local residents in order for them to directly benefit from and take ownership of new activities, right? So it's not just thinking about how do we create new businesses, but really recognize that members of these primarily Black and Brown communities in the Calumet region have ideas for businesses that perhaps didn't have access to capital that could be activated. And finally, the fifth strategy is building an integrated infrastructure that recognizes both hard infrastructure, right? Our pipes, our trucks, our materials collection systems, but also soft infrastructures, so education and training and building social capital and relationships between diverse groups of people. Next slide. Kind of how this then developed, we spent a summer where we had a group of students just focusing on taking these 5 strategies and trying to develop some physical prototypes and activities. And I think it's really important to recognize that, as someone who comes into circular economy from a materials perspective, some of these ideas that were prototyped were kind of surprising because they weren't obviously circular economy, but they were identified by the stakeholders as things that were the highest priorities for them. So the first at Calumet was a digital platform for civic empowerment to mediate the interactions amongst residents. So for example, we talked about maybe developing like a currency system to reward people for taking care of abandoned buildings on their block. And so it was a digital platform to recognize and reward those who were taking care of their neighborhoods. The second, Value Calumet, was a business model for community economic empowerment by creating new products out of industrial byproducts and mining landfills for useful waste. The third, Flag Calumet, was a collectively built modular art installation that also gathered data about environmental conditions to increase the local residents' understanding of and connection with the local environment. And the fourth, Mini Calumet, was a simulation game designed to support local youth to explore alternative governance systems to deal with the challenges in the region. Next slide. We then advanced 2 of these micro-pilots, the ACT Calumet and the Flag Calumet, by iterating and refining the infrastructures that were prototyped and then worked to co-design alternative models for scaling up the implementation and impact. So as an example, in the photos that are here in this slide, we worked with high school students from the Chicago Public Schools to continue prototyping the Flag Calumet. So by building the devices themselves, the students learned about brownfields, environmental pollution, digital technology for sensing and analyzing environmental data, and about valuing the infrastructure and resources, including the existing abandoned sites, and really that we're honoring the knowledge and labor of members of the community. So while this isn't a typical circular economy project, we and our partners really learned about the priorities in Black and Brown communities that, environmental education and having access to, build these devices where we're partnering kind of environmental knowledge with computer science and digital knowledge was a really important way to use this underutilized asset of brownfields in these neighborhoods in this region. And so these assets could then become a source of learning, revitalization, and circularity. Next slide. I'm just going to run through another example. Is another project that I've been involved with is called The Plant. So this is a collaborative community of about 24 small businesses that are focused on sustainable urban food production and waste reuse in Chicago. So this is a former meat packing plant. This illustration is what the idealized system might look like, where the waste from these food companies go into an anaerobic digester that generates energy that fuels the buildings, right? So this is circularity in action. And one of the things that that has come up with this work, there are a lot of indoor farms. And by looking at the variety of resources, so not just materials and energy, it became obvious that this little circular building, which incidentally is located on the southwest side of Chicago in a predominantly Mexican-American community, had zero relationship with the community. So it was, you know, kind of like all of these white hippies biking in from the north side to work in their sustainable business with very little relationship and engagement with the surrounding community. And so one of the things that we've worked to do is to build opportunities for engagement through things like farmers markets, through targeted and intentional employment of people from those communities in order to address the question of equity. Next slide. So I'm now broadening this work, looking at how controlled environment agriculture, which is really growing dramatically across the US. So there are hundreds of small greenhouses and indoor farms, as well as a few large ones that have really garnered media attention and private equity funding, such as New Jersey-based AeroFarms, which is pictured here, and San Francisco-based Plenty. Right? And so the key idea of these indoor farms is that they can grow vegetables more efficiently in a controlled environment, away from climate uncertainties and pests in the field, eliminating the need for pesticides, but they also require a significant amount of energy to run the lights, the HVAC, the automation systems. And so what I'm doing now is, you know, kind of taking the work that I've done with the plant to transfer up to other CEA facilities across the country. Next slide. So I'm involved in an initiative where we're trying to develop a sustainability standard for this emerging industry, much like how LEED was able to transform and create a market for green buildings. So we have a dozen people from industry, academia, and government who are working together to identify the core areas for sustainability of CEA enterprises. So as you can imagine, we're paying a lot of attention to utilities, energy, water, HVAC, and striving for efficiency, the use of natural light, renewable sources, the choice of materials for the construction of the greenhouses, as well as for their growth systems, trying to emphasize the recyclability of these materials. So, you know, so these organisms, right, can be little circular economy enterprises even of themselves. But what I'd like to focus on is how we're looking at this last category of equity and localness. Next slide. So the equity and localness category aims to promote mutually beneficial relationships between CEA facilities, other businesses, and the communities in which they operate. So we're suggesting that these facilities strive not only to hire from the communities that they're operating within, but to provide training for their employees and pathways to ownership. Right. So I also work in urban agriculture more broadly, and there's such an obvious contrast, right? So a lot of the urban agriculture enterprises that I'm involved with are being run by Black and brown entrepreneurs for whom it's incredibly hard to secure land tenure and the capital that's needed to successfully operate. Well, CEA tends to be awash with cash, right? And then, you know, like I joke to my colleagues in this work, you know, it's like the tech bros, right? So it's folks who are coming in with computer science degrees, you know, trying to apply all of this tech to agriculture. And there's a lot of money in it, but there are significant barriers to entrepreneurs of color trying to enter this space. Now, there are many examples of CEA facilities that are building education programs with schools, doing things like having donations to food deserts, building relationships with Black, Indigenous, and people of color owned businesses. And so, you know, in thinking about developing a sustainability standard for this industry, we were just really concerned that, you know, like we need to bring in the equity dimension as well. And I'm actually super pleased that, you know, like all of these tech guys were very open to that. And I think, you know, it speaks to the moment that we're in. Although I'd say, you know, that we've been talking about equity, you know, before, you know, all of the recent disruptions in the last few months and the protests. And so I'm, you know, super excited to hear that you guys are also talking about really engaging equity. All right, let me pause here and see if there are any questions or comments about this work.
Sounds like a fabulous, I was just going to write in the text box there, it's chat box there, just what you were just highlighting is a great success too. So this is, I love the theory and action here in the field.
Thank you.
Any questions as we're going along from anyone? And you feel free to drop them in writing as well, but.
Doctor, I'm curious how you defined equity. Equity means a lot of things to a lot of people. How did you define it here, and how, I can see some of the ways it's being applied, but how did you go about thinking about that definition?
So we think about it as the relationships that we are building with the communities that we want to recognize past injustices and to address those in a way that aligns with the mission and the activities of the business. So we're not exclusively looking at racial equity, but also at socioeconomic issues and different ways that different communities have been marginalized.
Thanks, Ned. And there's a question in the chat box from Dana asking to Dr. Ashton, where are the products sold from the?
So I think most of the products coming out of the plant are sold mainly in the Chicago market, so relatively local, although I think there's some of the businesses who have significant online platforms and are selling across the country. And in CA more broadly, you know, like because the focus is on local production, and like much of what's produced in those facilities tend to be sold in those areas. And I'm trying to think of like another must be the indoor farms in Minnesota, and I don't think there are any in our group, but yeah, tend to be very local. Right, and I think that is, something that we're seeing more with COVID, and especially for food products, that the resilience of the local food supply chain has really come up into attention because of the disruption of longer supply chains with COVID. There's a question from Rolf about similar work going on elsewhere in the world. Yeah, I think there are pockets in different places. I know that I did want to say, so one thing that I feel that your coalition is one of the few business groups in North America that I'm seeing, like such a strong focus on circular economy as a collective, collaborative approach. And I think that's something that you guys can definitely leverage. I feel that for the most part, there's not a groundswell around circular economy. But yeah, I think there are like little pockets of circular economy in different parts of the world, right? So I mean, so a ton of stuff going on in Europe, particularly in the Netherlands, much fewer and far between here in the US.
We're working on changing that. Thanks. And another question from Abby about any specific tips, Dr. Ashton, for finding diverse stakeholders to engage on projects or design.
Yeah. So that's a great question, Abby. And the way that we have gone about this is first kind of seeing where your facilities are, right? So what neighborhoods, what communities they're engaged, they're operating, without identifying whether there are community-based organizations within those places. We try to identify the nonprofit organizations that are active in those regions, and have really used like a snowball approach, right? So I talk to this person and they tell me to talk to this other person. And so that it is a very organic way. And I think one of the challenges, and I think, there was maybe this was in my great breakout group, but, who we get in a room at any one time is intentional, right? And we try to identify, okay, we want to have someone from business, someone from the nonprofit, someone from these particular communities where we're operating within, and we don't always get that right mix of people, but by just spending I think a fair bit of time and being intentional about looking at the diversity of organizations, of ethnic groups, of gender, that's a way that we try to be intentional about bringing diverse people in. And then, by using design workshops, it's a way to really bring people's engagement in a very hands-on way to bring out their knowledge, right? So it's not just interviews, but it's demonstrating some prototypes so they get a chance to interact and give their thoughts, share their knowledge about it.
This is great. Dr. Ashton, do you want to go to your next slides or the next poll? Or what's the next specs? We could probably ask questions all day, but I know you have a little more material too.
Yes, and the next few slides are meant to kind of push us into thinking about the breakout groups. All right, so this next question is, who's driving the circular economy in the US? And I believe this should be it's a ranking question. So industry, government, NGOs, public.
Like NGOs are winning for now.
Gonna comment, I think we still have a good mix of all of these groups on the call right now yet, so.
Oh, I think I left out academia.
That's ironic. It looks like we settled in kind of at
all right.
and then industry.
Yeah, so I'm actually teaching a course in the circular economy right now, and last week we had a guest lecture with a colleague from the Portuguese Ministry of Environment who was talking about all of the initiatives that they're doing, and all of the students in my class were like, wow, you know, like they're so much more advanced, and it makes us feel like we are so far behind. And so I do think, yeah, it's NGOs and industry who are leading this conversation, that government really is not in terms of policy. And there are probably a few places around the country where we have the public calling for more circular products, but for the most part, they don't know what that means, right? And so as we move into the breakout groups, I'd like us to think about who's not included in these conversations, and what are some of the perspectives. But I think, you know, you guys are, you know, such a well-informed audience. You guys are doing this work. So none of these are going to be surprises. So the next slide. So I think there is a narrative that the circular economy is really being promoted by folks in Europe, right? And so it's a Western response to looking at the problems of the linear economy and how we might address them. And so I'd like to just reflect and incorporate that circular thinking has been a part of indigenous epistemologies for centuries, right? And so this quote from Sherry Mitchell is that we're seeing the world through the indigenous lens, requires that we see that indigenous communities, for the most part, through centuries, have been thinking about how to live in ways that are in harmony and balance between humans and nature. Next slide. One of the emerging trends is redefining the role of citizens. So moving beyond thinking about citizens as consumers, but also as prosumers, so that we are capable of producing as well as consuming, right? So the product at the end of its life becomes a resource for a business. And as this graphic illustrates, that we can also play an active part in repairing as part of product life extension, and that doesn't always need to be done by corporates. So this means giving up power over to citizens and engaging them in different ways. And so I just, you know, like to echo a point that Mike Harley made earlier about what we're willing to give up. And so thinking about the role of citizens in the circular economy and how to engage the public. So not just as consumers, but as producers, as repairers in the economy as well. Next slide. And I'd also like to add a point about the distribution of cost and benefits in the circular economy. So if we look at our supply chains and what happens at the end of life, it's often, and this is the case in almost every part of the world, that it's the poorest and most marginalized people who are doing the dirtiest jobs of collecting and managing waste. And they're also paid the least. So we can just click on the next slide. So as we shift to circularity, we need to think about how to incorporate their knowledge and how we might improve livelihoods and safety. So as we think about, you know, like how do we incorporate circular economy equity into the circular economy, we need to engage diverse stakeholders and partners. See citizens as co-creators, not just consumers, and examine who bears the costs and reaps the benefits within our value networks, and reflect on how we can address historical and ongoing injustice and oppression of distinct communities through the circular economy. Right, so I will stop there, Amy.